At Stony Brook University, Dr. Flynn teaches undergraduate courses and doctoral seminars on social theory, race, ethnicity, and qualitative methods. She is the faculty advisor to the Black Writing Student Organization and has also been the faculty advisor to the Black Women's Association. She organizes a critical race and intersectionality reading group and previously ran a graduate workshop on race, ethnicity, and inequality. In September of this year, Dr. Fleming published her second book, How to Do Less Stupid About Race, on Racism, White Supremacy, and the Racial Divide. The book is a guide to breaking through the half-truths and ridiculous misconceptions that have thoroughly corrupted the way race is represented in classroom, pop culture, media, and politics. A native of Tennessee, Crystal grew up in New Jersey and Pennsylvania near Philly. She enjoys meditating, writing, travel, wig snatching with white supremacy, good wine, and dog dinner. She is joining us from New York City, where she lives with her cat Tag. With a warm welcome, let's invite Ms. Dr. Fleming.
Thank you. What a warm welcome. Can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
All right. You like the pants too? Okay. All right. Listen, I know you all expected to have Clint Smith, so I hope not to let you down too much. I'm so excited to be here. When I woke up this morning in New York City, I had no idea that I'd be joining you all this evening. So on my way to the airport, I was coming to Boston for my book tour. I have about 5 events over the next week. And I got the notice about this event, and I was just delighted to be considered. So thank you so much. Thank you. So you see the title of my talk. It's really going to be more of an interactive conversation. I checked in with the organizers. I've adapted it for you because usually, you know, I drop the F-bombs and I curse a little bit every now and then from my college and adult audiences. But I'm adapting it a little bit for you. If something slip out, I hope you give me, We'll see. I'll try to clean it up for you. But so I'm gonna talk with you about the importance, right? The importance of young people making change in our society. And I was thinking about my own experience in high school. The students who introduced me were very kind to talk about all this stuff that I've done. But I'm gonna tell you about what it was like for me before I knew I was gonna do any of that. I'm gonna tell you about some of the people that made it possible for me to be on the stage today. And I remember when I was in your shoes, when I was in high school, I attended a national conference for student leaders. And at the time I was interested in diversity, but I didn't know a lot about it. Now when I say I didn't know a lot about it, now I'm Black, so I knew about being me, but I didn't know about the history of systemic racism in this country. I didn't know about white supremacy, right? I knew about the KKK, but I didn't know about how white supremacy is woven into all of our major institutions, into our educational system, into popular culture. I didn't know about this. So I'm gonna share with you a little bit today about my journey, and again about some of the people and opportunities that make my work possible. But before we do that, I wanna talk about you. You're student leaders. Many of you already involved in activism, connected to your community. So I want to see a show of hands. How many people in this room have a sense of the kind of changes you want to see in society? Show of hands. You have a vision of some of the change you'd like to see. Maybe you're also clarifying that vision. Can I have some volunteers? Those of you who put your hands in the air, I want you to tell me just one thing you want to happen, one change you'd like to see right here. No more double standards. Sex and gender double standards. What else? Yes?
More people of color in political positions.
More people of color in political positions. Yes?
I want to see more Black educators, specifically female Black educators.
We don't have a lot. You know, when I was in school, until college, I didn't have any. Okay? What else? Yes.
Equal access to education at the elementary and middle school level.
Yes, equal access to education. Anyone else? Yes.
Less black men and women in prison.
Yes. Yes, less black men and women in prison. Up front. Less racial discrimination. Yes.
Inform minorities on the importance of education.
The importance of an education for minorities, right? Which is so powerful. I know y'all are going to Harvard tomorrow. Is that right? Anyone know who Carter G. Woodson is? All right. I hear a little bit. Carter G. Woodson, among other things, right? We have a Black History Month because of the Black History Week that he created. And he also wrote a really important work called The Miseducation of the Negro. Right? Carter G. Woodson went to Harvard, and he wrote about how he was both educated and miseducated there. And it's in that spirit of Carter G. Woodson that I wrote my book, which I'll talk about with you in a little bit, How to Be Less Stupid About Race, because I got my PhD from Harvard University. And while I had some of the best educators in the world at my disposal, right? One of the world's largest libraries at my disposal, amazing world-class education. In many ways, I was miseducated about race and racism at Harvard University, and I had to unlearn a lot of the nonsense that I absorbed at Harvard. I might need some tech help because that screen has just gone dead and I don't know what's going on here. Okay, while we get that figured out, can I get just a few more volunteers about the kind of change you want to see, and then we'll move on? In the back, yes?
Accountability in our police system.
Say that again, accountability in? Policing, yes, 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 yes. In the blue in the back.
Breaking heteronormative masculine standards.
Breaking heteronormative masculine standards. Yes. Reach, yes. Okay, a couple more. Then we'll move on. In the front. Informing minorities on financial literacy. Now, y'all told me to turn on the microphone, but it's up too high. Okay. Yes, financial literacy. Yes. Mental health for Black boys in particular, but the population in general. That is so important. That is so important. I know when I was growing up, no one talked about mental health. Everything was, we just solved it through prayer. Yes. And nothing wrong. I still pray. Well, listen, I go to my therapist too. Right. Got all the sides covered. I'm praying we're going to go to the therapist too. Yes.
More minority students in honors and AP classes.
More minority students in honors and AP classes. Who's in an honors or AP course in this class? Yes. We need more of those. Yes. We need more of those. Because I'm sorry we're having these technical difficulties. I also can just ignore this and we can just keep talking. All right, we don't forget about the slides. We're just gonna, okay, well if it comes back good, if not, I just wanted to say about AP and honors courses. We're not supposed to be in them by design. The system was set up so that people who look like me, people like many of you in the audience, are not supposed to be there. And when I was a student, I didn't know that. Right? Now y'all are way more woke than I was when I was in high school. I have to just tell y'all, like y'all, you're talking about heteronormative masculinity. You're talking about systemic, problems with the police. I didn't know about these issues when I was a young person. And so when I would see mistreatment or when I would see injustice, I didn't have a lens for understanding it historically. I didn't have a lens for understanding it sociologically. And so if you have come to learn about these issues and to be involved as student activists and leaders, it's because someone had to teach you. Someone had to share with you. Someone had to, okay, we got something happening? Okay. Okay. Someone had to share the knowledge with you. to connect your own experiences to a broader history and to knowledge about systemic oppression. So I don't think we're gonna have slides, I don't care. I'm just gonna jump right in and tell you what I came to tell you. Here are the three things that I want you to keep in mind as we think about how young people can and will make change, right? Three things I want you to keep in mind. Number one is that, believe it or not, and you probably will believe it, you are literally the future. I don't mean on some Whitney, I believe the children, in that sentimental way, but in a real way. Right, sometimes there's the perception that young people are too young to make change, but nothing could be farther from the truth. Old ass people don't want you to know how powerful you are. They don't want you to know how powerful you are. There are things that you can do as a young person that an older person, they're too comfortable. They're too settled. They want to keep their job, right? And there's nothing wrong with keeping your job. I want to keep mine. But as young people, particularly working together and organizing collectively, you are uniquely positioned to bring about powerful change. So young people, you are quite literally the future. So all of those things that you're mentioning, the kinds of systemic changes that you want to see, they're only going to happen if people like you in this room make it happen. All right. I'll bring up the slides since I went through the trouble of making them. And we'll keep it moving. Okay. There we go. All right. So as I've already done, I wanted to start with you, right? The student activists and leaders in this room. And start with your vision, start with the values that are important to you. Because as you move forward in your education, you finish high school, go on to college, you go back to your communities, you're going to, we hope, remain involved in the activities that you've decided are important, the areas of impact that you'd like to make. But there are going to be obstacles. There are going to be people who will tell you, you can't do it. And I want you to leave tonight with not just a clear focus maybe on the specific changes you'd like to see, but also an action plan about how you can make that happen. So I want to start with you in thinking about the importance of recognizing your unique talents. And not just recognizing your unique talents, but also working hard to develop them. Many times students come to me and whether they're taking my courses on race and ethnicity or whatever they're learning with me, they want to talk about how they can leverage what they're learning in the classroom to bring about change. And they're looking for their purpose. And one of the things I want to make clear is that someone like me can't tell you what your purpose is. Only you know what your unique talents are, right? What you have had to persevere, the kinds of life experiences that you have been through that make you an expert on your own life, right? All of that is going to go into the kind of change that you want to see. You're being able to leverage your experience, your unique talents, your valuable knowledge, right? There are a lot of people in this room who support your vision and believe in you, and you want to surround yourself with people who believe in you. The people who are the naysayers who say, oh, I don't know if we can address systemic issues and police violence. I don't know if we can address the underrepresentation of minorities in education in AP and honors classes. I don't know if we can address white supremacy, right? Those people, they're going to exist, but you're going to need to surround yourself with people who believe in you and in the vision that you're articulating. So you're a visionary, and you're the future. So how do we go about concretely bringing about some of this change? Let me tell you now a little bit about me You've already heard a long bio, so I'm not going to go through all that. But you can follow me on Twitter. I can't promise you what you're going to encounter on Twitter. Probably some F-bombs from time to time. Probably me dropping knowledge about systemic racism and white supremacy, wig snatching, ignorance, and foolishness. And over the years, it was quite unexpected. I didn't, as a student, have a social media account or anything, but as a faculty member, I did begin to, blog and tweet, and eventually that led to building an audience. Kind of scares me to think about it, but millions of people read what I write on Twitter on a monthly basis, and it's actually really scary. Because millions of people. I can't even deal with like there's 200 of y'all in this room. Like that's like damn. That's the book, How to Be Less Stupid About Race. It just dropped last month, and I've written it. It's my second book. It's very different from my first book, which was about racism in France, and it was very academic. That first book. This one is a book for everybody. At least I hope so. It's a book for people who want to better understand the origins and roots of systemic racism and think about what we can do to address it. It's also a book that tries to shift the national conversation from, oh, white supremacy is the KKK. White supremacy are white nationalists. White supremacy are neo-Nazis. Yeah, white supremacy is all of that. But white supremacy is also how our society has been structured since day one. And that's folks on the far right, the mid-right, the center, the left, right, have all been implicated in white supremacy. And the book also sort of takes that perspective and explores its implications for our society, for politics, for culture. I also talk about my own experience, how it is that I went from, as I said earlier, not knowing much about these issues to studying them, writing about it, and also focusing on activists. That's been a theme in my research, whether it was in the Boston area. They said that I did a thesis on Boston spoken word artists, which is true. But I was specifically in that work interested in activists who were using performance to address social inequalities. And that's a theme that carried forward in my work in France. I focused on activism there. And in any case, How to Be Less Stupid About Race. It's not academic. I hope it's for everyone. So if you check it out, you can let me know what you think on Twitter. So I want to say a few words about, what's not on the CV, what's not, in the bio. This is me, when I was like 7 years old. What can I say about young Crystal? I was gap-toothed. I needed braces. I was born in Tennessee and to a single mom. So I was raised by my mom. She had to drop out of college to take care of me. Any other kids of single moms in the house? Am I the only ones? Single moms? Yes. I wouldn't be here without my mom. Wouldn't be here without her. And I guess what I want to say is that the odds were stacked against me. The odds were stacked not just against me, but against us. The odds were stacked against my mom being able to provide for our family, having dropped out of college. The odds were stacked against me being able to get into an AP track, right? If I hadn't been singled out, really by chance, by an educator in the second grade, I never would have gotten to where I am today. In the second grade, I had a teacher who saw that I was doodling in class, thought that my doodles kind of meant that I was creative, and she said, I think you need to take an IQ test. I said, I didn't even know what that was. I was like, okay, sure, I show up, I don't know what's going on, take a little test. And after that test, I got tracked. I was in public school, and I got tracked into gifted and talented classes in public school. And what I didn't know back then is that little black girls are not usually singled out for that. We're assumed, because of systemic racism and sexism, to not be gifted. There's so many other kids who deserve to be in that classroom and who were not singled out because of how we look and because of cultural expectations about who a genius is, who a creative person is, right? But I didn't know any of this growing up. In college, went to Wellesley College, which isn't far from here. In college, I actually thought I would be a biochemist. I had been involved in doing biochemistry and molecular pharmacology research as a high school student. I was a weird kid. I was a weird kid. You know, I was like in Star Trek and shit. I mean, you know, biochemistry, molecular pharmacology. I mean, I still live in Star Trek. Jean-Luc Picard. Anybody know about Picard? Nobody knows about Picard. Yes. Give it up for Picard. Did y'all? Okay, just an aside. Y'all don't know who Picard is, but he's the captain of the Starship Enterprise, and he is coming back. Does anybody know? Star Trek fans, there's a new show with Jean-Luc. Anyway, I can tell you about Jean-Luc. There's a new show coming out. If you don't know about it. Anyway, so I thought that I was going to be a biochemist. First year of college, right? I happened to take a sociology course. It was just to fulfill a requirement. I don't really care about sociology. And in that course, we happened, and it was taught by a self-described white Jewish guy. And we're still very good friends today. He's an amazing educator. His name is Ira Silver. And in that class, we happened to read a book, and this book changed my life. So I recommend you reading it in case you're interested in issues of systemic racism and class oppression and how we can challenge it. The book is called Ain't No Making It. Ain't No Making It by Jay McLeod. And it was written by a Harvard undergraduate with a senior thesis. And this guy spent a summer working with low-income youth, both black and white low-income youth. And he tracked how they fared in school and then followed them into their careers. And one of the things that Jay McLeod realized in his study is that even the kids who worked hard in school, who followed the rules, who did what you need to do to get a good job and be an upstanding citizen, that following the rules and working hard was not enough. It was not enough. And why wasn't it enough? Because of systematic racism, but also classism, right? And so that was an opportunity for me to realize that there's something else going on in our society besides how hard you work. Because I don't know about you, but the black people in my family, they work really hard. In fact, we have to work twice as hard for the same recognition. And this is something that people from other marginalized backgrounds also experience. So it's not just about hard work. It's not just about your merit. It's not just about your intellect and your talents. It's also about what's going on with inequalities and power. So that class was an eye-opener for me, and it set me on my path to becoming a researcher. And the thing about that class, too, is that we just didn't learn about the problems. We didn't just learn about oppression. We didn't just learn that, oh, the odds are stacked against us. We also learned that we have power. But we don't have power merely as individuals. We have to actively mobilize and organize together to bring about systemic change. So that's a little backstory with me being a weird kid and some of the opportunities and experiences that brought me to the study of sociology and the work that I do around systemic oppression. Okay, so I've already talked about the importance of developing your unique talents. Now I want to talk about the importance of finding your tribe. When you think about what you're going to do when you go back to your communities, I understand you're kind of sitting at tables with people that you know, right? Most of yours know. Yeah, right? So you have a little tribe already. But as you move into the next phase of your education and of your professional life, you're going to continue to have to find allies. So finding allies is going to be one of the most important things you can do to work collectively and to identify people who share your values. So it's not everybody who shares the values that you've expressed in this room. It's not everybody who values diversity, who values equity, who values social justice. In fact, I'd say that it's almost always the minority of our population that values these things. You are in an important minority, so that means you're gonna have to seek out other people wherever you go who share your values, right? This is your tribe. And then when you think about concrete steps, you're going to have to work with your tribe, collaborate, and find opportunities to serve, right? This is how you're going to be able to leverage your impact. Because if we have systemic problems, the only way to address it is collectively, right? All right. Can I get an amen? Can I get a solid amen? All right, so in the interest of time, I'm going to kind of quickly go through some of these things, but I just want to give you some specific examples of youth and impact, right? Both historical and present day, that really show the power of young people to change our society. So, show of hands, who knows what SNCC stands for? Not snitch. SNCC. I can't hear you. Yes, in the green. Can we get your attention? What does SNCC stand for?
Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee.
Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. If you don't know, yes, that's correct. By the way, applause. So if you've never heard of SNCC, you really should write it down and commit it to memory. Because as a student leader and student activist, you're going to have to draw on historical examples of how other young people have made important changes. SNCC is one of the most important civil rights organizations that ever existed in this country, and it was driven by young people, driven by students, and many of us, if not almost all of us, wouldn't be in this room without the kind of civil rights activism and organizing and disruption of systemic inequality that SNCC was involved in. Activism and education. Someone said in the audience that they wish that there were more faculty of color, maybe especially more, was it you, black women, professors? I could not be a professor. I could not pursue my education and get a PhD if students had not organized and had sit-ins and campus demonstrations. We wouldn't have the insufficient representation we have, but we wouldn't even have that without student activism. The fact that we have Africana studies, ethnic studies today, that's only because students organized, right? So the gains that have been made, which aren't enough, have come about largely through student activism. Of course, with contemporary examples, right? We could look to the involvement of young people with Black Lives Matter. We could look to the Parkland survivors and what they're still doing around gun violence. We could also look to something called We Charge Genocide. And so I'm going to briefly show you, have see show of hands who's heard of We Charge Genocide? No one? Great, so I'm going to teach you something. Look at that. So We Charge Genocide. I had an activist from, actually from Chicago, she's now in New York, named Mariam Kaba. I had her come to my university, Stony Brook, and she talked about the activism of young people in this movement that was called We Charge Genocide. So just briefly about police torture in Chicago, that's what the movement was oriented around. Between 1972 and 1991, over 100 African American men and women were tortured in Chicago. And when we say tortured, we mean tortured. This is all information from the We Charge Genocide website. We're talking about electrocution, sexual abuse. The electrocution also, this was done by the police to African American men and women, electrocution of their genitals. And why did they do this? To coerce confessions, which were used to imprison these same people that they tortured, to prosecute and imprison them. In some cases, the torture victims were sentenced to death. But there were survivors. Many of them have been exonerated and released. All of those who had been sentenced to death have now been freed or removed from death row. Today, over 20 known survivors of this police torture remain incarcerated. But there's more to this story. In 2010, 30 years after these acts of torture and brutality, John Burge, who was the commissioner who oversaw this horrible effort to violate and oppress African Americans, he was actually convicted. He was convicted of perjury and obstruction of justice, but he was only sentenced to 4.5 years in prison. Okay. And except for this single conviction, no other police authority was ever held accountable. No one else. Now, where do young people come in? Young people in Chicago joined forces with survivors to address police torture and injustice. And this took the form of everything from creative memorials to bring attention to what people experienced because it had been long suppressed and not talked about. You can imagine if you'd been tortured, you might not want to talk about it because it's traumatic. And they also organized what became the first successful reparations campaign against a police department in history. Because of the work of young people in partnership with survivors of police torture in Chicago, a delegation went all the way to Geneva, Switzerland to speak before the UN and say, we charge genocide. We charge genocide. In other words, what happened in Chicago was the use of state violence to oppress African Americans, and there needs to be accountability. And when I say that they won this reparations case, there was a tangible outcome. The young people and survivors were able to get a court case that resulted in a settlement of millions of dollars for survivors. Now, of course, we know that money is not enough, right, to address torture. But what they were able to accomplish was historic. So again, I share this because when I had Miriam Kaba, the activist I mentioned, by the way, you can follow her on Twitter, Prison Culture is her Twitter handle. And she is on a daily basis sharing resources around activism and organizing. But when I had her come to Stony Brook, she focused on the gains made by We Charge Genocide as an example of what can be accomplished when people work together to bring about systemic change. All right, so how am I doing with time? How much time do I have before we stop for Q&A? Probably like 30 seconds? 10 minutes?
Yeah.
These are 6 minutes, all right.
No, 15.
Oh, okay. That's better than 6. So I want to now shift and just share with you, I know many of you have a background in working around issues of racism, but I want to make sure that we have some basic definitions so we're all on the same page. And this is some of the material I covered and how to be less stupid about race. I see some people have taken notes, that's great. I want to make sure I don't put you to sleep though, so we're not going to spend too much time on these definitions, but I do want to share them with you. Whenever I teach about race, I start with power. Because if you don't understand power, you're not going to understand what race is and how racism functions. And you could say the same thing about sexism, patriarchy, transphobia, class oppression. If you don't understand power, you're going to have no idea what those things really are. And so if you think about power fundamentally, you know power when you feel it. It's the ability to get what you want. That's a fundamental definition of power. And race itself is a modern concept that was designed specifically to empower the majority population. And so race is the belief in visible, immutable, that is unchangeable, hierarchical differences between human groups defined in terms of biology, physical appearance, so we could add ancestry as well. But what I want you to retain is that race is fundamentally about power. And it was created as a concept to literally divide people in order to empower and enrich the majority population. Sometimes people say when we talk about race, we're being divisive. No, race was created to divide us. That's why it was created. It was created to divide us and empower European colonizers. When we talk about systemic racism, here's another definition for you. We're talking about collective practices. Collective practices of domination that disadvantage categories of humans on the basis of their perceived race. Now, one of the major misconceptions about racism is it's about my feelings. It's how you feel about me or how I feel about you. That's not what racism is. That's prejudice. That's prejudice. But there's a difference, right? I'm seeing some head nods, right? And one of the things that's very common is for members of the majority population, when they're called out on racism, or when racism is brought up as an issue at all, they collapse into this very individualistic understanding of racism as just feelings. And it's not. We have to be clear that racism is a system of power. It's not just about your feelings. And then that brings me to white supremacy. Now, you already know my spiel, so I'm just going to tell you this definition. White supremacy, not just the KKK. Specifically, it's the social, political, and economic dominance of people socially defined as white. And as a sociologist, that last part is really important. Socially defined as white. Because who counts as white has changed over time. And it's still, right? Oh, okay. Right? You know, it's changed over time. Right? People who have come from parts of Europe, right? We're told, well, you're not quite white, or you're not white enough, right? Because the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant was held up on a hierarchy as better than all the rest of Europe's people. And so one of the things that people don't know about race and white supremacy often is that they think about it as sort of a distinction between the whites and the non-whites. And it is about that. But white supremacy is also about a hierarchy between Europeans, between Italians, the Irish, the English, the French, the Germans, and so on. So white supremacy, the social, political, economic dominance of people socially defined as white, over time, what's constant about it is that whoever is fit into that white category, or whichever groups are seen as proximate to whiteness, maybe not white, but close enough, that those groups then have access to power, resources, better education, better neighborhoods, less exposure to toxic environments, wealth building, land, right? One of the things I taught my students early this semester, I think about what white power really means. The state of Georgia gave out land from indigenous people through a lottery to white men. They just gave it away. Gave it away to white folks. Take this indigenous land. It's like Mega Millions. The land. White supremacy is a system of handouts from white people to white people. It's a system of entitlement that has been built over the course of generations. So when we think about things like the racial wealth gap, where did it come from? It came from the intentional, overtly racist policies that our country was built on. Okay? So, some basic definitions. In my work, I emphasize the importance of becoming racially literate, which is also, going to be grounded in history. We can't understand what's happening today without looking to the past. And I share that as someone who, I have to be very honest, history used to put me to sleep. Read a history book like this dry ass Who do you think benefits from our not reading our history? Who else? Rich people, powerful people, those who want to maintain the society status quo as it is, they benefit from us getting tired when we crack open a history book. They benefit from us not being able to understand how power works in our society. So I'm being very honest. I'm now obsessed with history. I love history, but it took a long time for me to get there. And so if you are like I was, and you're like, I'm about history, I encourage you to begin the process of learning your history and learning the history of our country. Because without that knowledge, you're not going to be able to bring about the change you seek. All right, so becoming racially literate. We're surrounded by a lot of ignorance. We're surrounded by historical ignorance, racial ignorance, gender ignorance, and go on and on. I see some of you are familiar with some of these names. Okay, I know I just have a few minutes left, so I do want to leave you with some statistics that can increase, hopefully, your racial and social literacy. These are numbers from the U.S. Census Bureau, just to give you some sense. We've talked about disparities, some of you brought up disparities in different social spheres. We can't really understand the concept of disparities, though, unless we understand the way our society is composed. You know, beginning of the semester, I had my college students, I had them estimate the size of the white population, the Hispanic or Latinx population, African American, Asian, indigenous. I put them on the board. I didn't put the numbers, but I said, I want you to write down your population estimates, right? What percentage of the population is what you consider white or Asian? And let me tell you this, they were not even close to the real numbers. There were some of my students who thought that whites are already a minority. There are some of my students who thought that African Americans are more numerous than whites. There were some students who thought the indigenous population was 10 times larger than it is. And here's the thing. My students are not alone. National surveys have shown that most Americans have no idea, really, how our society is composed. They tend to underestimate the white population and overestimate the minority population. And why do you think that might be? Why would people overestimate minorities? Media, what else? We stick out against the majority population. And so this misapprehension of how our society is composed contributes to so many of these systemic problems. Okay, so these are the demographics. Now, let me tell you about white economic dominance. This is a chart that shows the median wealth by educational attainment for working households under the age of 55. And what I want to bring your attention to is on the far left here. We see that whites with less than a high school education have higher median wealth than blacks with at least some college. We look at the gap between whites with some college and blacks with some college. We're looking at the difference between 79,000 and 11,000. By the year 2020, the median white household will own 86 times the wealth of the median Latinx household, if nothing changes. If the kinds of change that you're trying to bring about doesn't happen, this is what we're going to see. White households hoard 12 to 13 times the wealth of African American families nationally. And much has been made about having a black president. One of you said you want to see more minorities in political representation, and that makes a lot of sense. We need more minorities in political representation, but it's not enough. Because when Barack Obama was president, 2016, in Washington, D.C., right, where the White House, appropriately named, is located, white households had 81 times the wealth of their African American neighbors while we had a black president in Washington, D.C. If you're having trouble thinking about how big that number is, the Earth is 81 times more massive than the moon. That's the racial wealth gap in our nation's capital. Yeah, it's crazy. It's crazy, but it's not. Because our society was built to produce this. Finally, politics. Because you are student leaders and you are involved in activism. And if you're working on issues of race, you're already involved in politics. So, white Americans represent between 60 and 77% of our population, depending on whether they identify as white only or white and Latinx. But they hold 90% of all elected offices. White men represent only 31% of our population. In a way, they're a minority, but they hold 65% of elected offices. White men exercise 8 times the political power of women of color. We could think about these issues intersectionally as well. How race intersects with gender to reproduce, particularly the power of white men in our society. You might not know this, but another thing about politics, our very first immigration law in this country is the 1790 Naturalization Act. At this time, the United States had been in existence for a few decades, and we had a problem in this country. There were too many undocumented people. And do you know what they did when the undocumented people were white men? Do you know what they did? They made them citizens. The Naturalization Act of 1790 made undocumented white men, gave them the possibility to become citizens. But the white part was explicitly, right, included as a criteria for citizenship. So when I talk about white supremacy, this is what I'm referring to. That it's not just certain pockets of our society. It's the whole damn thing. All right, I'm out of time, so I don't have an opportunity to go through all of this. You're welcome to take a picture of the slide. Also, this will be online. But this is just a little bit about the historical origins of white supremacy as the sprawling system of oppression that we've come to live with, and that the majority population benefits from generation to generation. Everything from settler colonialism and chattel slavery, to whites-only citizenship, to land and real estate, the 1862 Homestead Act. I talked about white supremacy as handouts from white people to white people. Hundreds of millions of acres just given out almost exclusively to white people. And someone talked about financial literacy. I think you should know that land ownership is very much tied to wealth building. So when you think about that huge gap between the median wealth of white families and black families' wealth, things like the Homestead Act, huge part of it. All right, so I'm gonna finish with what the hell can we do about it? Now, I actually don't have to preach to you about this because you're already doing work around this. Many of you are already doing work. but I'm going to share with you just a few suggestions about how we might be able to support and empower the vision that you have. So action steps for systemic change. The first thing, for me anyway, it was hard, and that was I had to give up magical thinking. Magical thinking. I can never turn this thing on. What do I mean? Is that too loud? Okay, so what did I mean by magical thinking? Many times when I'm teaching, I have students who come, as soon as they start learning about racism, they're like, how can we end it? Which is like normal because, I mean, if you're like a moral person, you don't want to continue racial oppression. And some students think that we can end it in our lifetime. Some of y'all don't because you won't. But so magical thinking for me is about having this facile notion that as soon as we start to work on something, we can just end it. We can just wave a magic wand like Harry Potter, like a woke-ass Harry Potter, and just, you know, and because you're already involved in activism, some of you, and maybe also because you've seen how deep the rabbit hole goes when it comes to systemic oppression, you understand, hopefully, that magical thinking is not the way to go. So activism is the antidote to magical thinking. Doing the damn work. And that doesn't mean that we can't bring about important transformations. We can. We wouldn't be in this room, many of us, without those prior transformations, but it's not by magic. It's through activism, it's through collective action, it's through visionaries like you all in this room, committing their vision to action. Raising awareness, consciousness raising. As an educator, it's my bread and butter, right? The educators who taught me about these issues changed my life. And so one of the things that you as student leaders also can be involved in is bringing the knowledge you have to a wider audience. We're connecting even to your community in a way that will broaden awareness. In this work, we have to be very attentive to centering marginalized communities. I have a chapter in my book. It's called Listen to Black Women. And it focuses on, it's a chapter about intersectionality and Black feminist thought. It explains my own journey to realizing the importance of Black feminist work. I have to say, you know, Black women and girls, we're not born, you know, quoting Angela Davis. You know, you can't come out of the womb if you have a black fist. You know, you can't make it out, actually, if you fist like this. You have to. In other words, you have to learn, right, the importance of centering marginalized perspectives. Even as a Black woman, I had to learn that. So in any work that you are doing, even if you are yourself a member of a marginalized group, it's important for us to ask, how are we centering the perspectives of other marginalized people? Maybe you're a racial minority, but then what about transgender people? Yes. Are you centering LGBT folks of color? Right? Are you thinking about class? Are you thinking about these issues in an intersectional way where we can center marginalized communities, particularly those maybe that you don't, right, belong to? We've talked about disparities in terms of your vision of some of the change you want to see. And so in your institutions and in your community, you have to be, and some of you are already doing this, you have to identify disparities. You have to get the statistics. You have to get the numbers as part of your work to address and redress these disparities. But all of this, you know, education, raising consciousness, statistics, listening to Black women, it's not enough. Because if we're just content with knowledge, we're not going to get far. Because we actually have to shift resources. We actually have to shift resources if we're going to shift power. So we can't just be content with a superficial diversity conversation. We have to look at how are resources distributed in our schools, in our local politics, in ownership of businesses, and so on, and we have to shift. We have to see what can we do to actually change that distribution of resources. And that's not going to happen without collective action, right, which is a major theme of this. And when ish hits the fan, when they tell you your vision's too ambitious, when they tell you you're not competent, when they tell you there's no problem, what racism? What sexism? What patriarchy? When they gaslight you, you wanna know what gaslighting means? Denying. Gaslighting is an abuse tactic where the abuser will deny what you're experiencing. They're going to deny reality. And many of us who work on issues of systemic oppression, we're gaslit all the time. We're told there's no problem. What are you upset about? When you are challenged in your work, you're going to have to commit and keep going. So how will you create this change? Going back to what I said at the beginning, these three things: developing your unique talents and believing in yourself, surrounding yourself with people who believe in you and your vision, putting the naysayers aside, because you're going to have them and you're going to have to keep going, finding your tribe, and finally, collaborating and finding opportunities to serve so that you can move beyond just being an individual and be part of a broad, systemic change. So with that, I want to thank you for your attention. Is there time for any questions? Do we have questions? I think there are microphones. If you have questions, you can come to the microphones. And they're recording, so they want to be able to hear you. So you can just go right up. And, yeah. Okay, since you're there, we're going to go first.
Okay, so you talk about how you teach like African American studies and critical theory, and there's like a large body of work in both of those fields that talk about how like our political desires are like so entrenched in white supremacy that engaging these types of processes won't be able to like improve, you know, the ontological positioning of blackness, like the work of Calvin Warren, and other things like that, like block nihilism. And so I was wondering how you engage that, and like also do this type of like very political work that you also talk about.
Yeah, that's a great. What's your name? Can you introduce yourselves too?
Oh yeah. I'm Quinn Hughes. I'm a sophomore from Evanston Township High School.
Quinn?
Yeah.
All right. What a wonderful question. When I say y'all some woke-ass student leaders, I mean it. Talk about nihilism. And Calvin Warren is one of the most, exciting theorists of anti-blackness. So for those of you who are not familiar with work around anti-blackness, scholars in Black studies and in philosophy have raised the question, right, of what kind of change, what kind of transformations can we see if our whole society is really built in a fundamental way on the denigration of Black life. And so it's really a question about hope and hopelessness also, because if Quinn used the word ontologically, so that sort of means if fundamentally our being in our society is rooted in anti-blackness, how can we have hope? So you asked how I engage this. I'll be very honest, it depends on which day of the week you ask me. It depends on the context also. The message that I have for students, if they ask me, hey, Professor Fleming, I'm working on a set of issues, how can I help? I'm not going to tell them, well, because of the ontological condition of blackness, you just give up. And that actually has been one of the criticisms of some of the work on anti-blackness, that it leads to a dead end with activism. What do you do if your philosophy tells you that at the end of the day, because of the conditions of modern capitalism and racial capitalism in particular, the institutionalization of white supremacy and the denigration of blackness in every sphere of our society, what do you do if that line of philosophy leads you to a dead end? So several years ago, when I actually met Professor Warren for the first time, and I was in a pretty hopeless place politically. They said earlier I worked for Democrats abroad, people were hoo-hooing, and I've said it was very exciting when I was a student, but then I became very disaffected with our politics. I saw the limits of what a black president could do in a society that's so systemically racist. And so I came to a point in my own politics and my own, sort of personal evaluation of these matters where I felt a lot of hopelessness. And I think that that's understandable. I don't think that you can care about these issues and not feel hopeless sometimes. But if some of my ancestors didn't have hope, if they didn't look at the crushing realities of anti-blackness, of state violence, if they didn't look at the conditions of institutionalized and monetized rape that slavery involved, and yet still find reason to not just survive, but to serve, to support their community, then I would not exist. And so it was around that time that I was thinking through these issues that you so astutely brought up, that I also met the woman I mentioned earlier, activist Mariame Kaba, who's an organizer. And she asked me, she said, Crystal, we were having brunch, and I was telling her, the situation's kind of hopelessness, it's kind of hopeless. And she said, well, Crystal, you can't be completely hopeless if you're an educator. And I had to sit with that because she was right. So there's certain things that I am hopeless about. For example, are we going to end police violence next week? No. Are we going to end many of the manifestations of white supremacy in our lifetimes? No. But if we don't look at what we can change, then that status quo will absolutely reproduce itself and grow. Because it's not just that things can't magically get better, they can realistically get worse. And one of the things we've seen in our history time and time again, many of you have studied what happened after the Civil War, technically the end of slavery, although we know it's still legal in the carceral system. What happened was Reconstruction, backlash against progress, and the re-entrenchment of white supremacy. We've seen that every time, and historian Ibram Kendi talks about this, that you have anti-racist progress and racist progress. You have the backlash to gains. And so, what is the utility of hope in a system that can feel hopeless? I care about not just my survival, but yours. And if I don't work to be hopeful about something, then the future you're going to inhabit could actually be worse than the one we're living in today. And the reason to hope is that you exist. Your existence is, and I don't want to get too, metaphysical, but I was looking the other day at some statistics around what are the odds of having ever been born? People were saying, what are the odds of winning the Mega Millions? Which was, pretty low odds. The odds of you ever coming into existence in the first place are more remote than winning $1.6 billion or whatever it is in Mega Millions. And that existence is miraculous. It can be miraculous. It's what you do with it. And if you decide to look at the challenges we face, all the suffering in the world, and you say, well, you know what, I throw my hands up because of the ontology of oppression, there's nothing I can do. Well, there are people in power who want us to conclude that there's nothing we can do. And so we have to look, if you work these issues, you have to look, even if you feel hopeless, and it's justified to have your faith challenged and your hope challenged, but you actually have to make it your business to look for opportunities to feel and be hopeful. You find that in community, you find that in service, You find it in looking for examples of where systemic change and important transformations occurred. You're going to find it in history. That's why you need to crack open those history books. You're not going to find it unless you look for it. And if you don't look for it, it's very easy to either go into magical thinking, oh, we could just fix all of it, and you can't, or go into the other extreme of there's nothing we can do. There is a middle, and that middle is we can make practical, substantive changes that do not require believing in a utopia or insisting that we can end all systemic problems. No. Human beings have been around for hundreds of thousands of years. And we've had struggles and inequalities throughout all of this time. And yet, we're still here. We're still here, and there's changes that we can make that I think are worth fighting for. I don't know, does that answer your question?
It does, thank you.
I'm sorry, did it just get hotter here?
Yeah.
Is it hot all right.
My name is Cece, and I go to Madison High School in Wisconsin, and I'm a senior.
Yes.
And my question is, I know you teach a lot of classes with a lot of different types of people in it, and I know you probably come across like a lot of ignorant students and a lot of ignorant people. And I want to ask, like, how do you go about educating those types of people without like coming out? You know what I'm trying to say?
Being like you.
Yeah, like how do you educate those types of people that you come across on like a daily basis?
Thank you, Cece, for your question. Are you asking because you think you're being an educator? Yeah, okay. How do you educate folks who are ignorant? So, depends on the context. I am not your teacher on Twitter. So, I tell my students, don't follow me on social media. Because I will cuss a mofo out. If they come at me with racist, misogynist, homophobic, right? I'm not that role in social media or in my personal life. But in the classroom, I have to come to this work with compassion. I have to. And I actually think that all real activist work has to have some form of compassion at its center, even when it's hard, because it can be really difficult when you come up against not just ignorance, but willful ignorance. But I asked you all, to talk about the visions that you had at the beginning of this talk, and you all are some very politically astute, educated folks, but you had a learning process, did you not? Did you? Or did you just, since 2 years old, you were talking about the ontological condition of blackness, disparities in higher education? No, you had a process. And so even if you start there, and that's also what I write a lot about, how to be less stupid about race, like my own learning process, because that's an avenue for compassion for me. You have to remember what it was like to not know what you know now. You have to remember what it was like to not take for granted the knowledge that you have now. And from that perspective, you can then try to reach people who aren't there yet, because you remember you haven't always been there. And you still have a ways to go. We are all, hopefully, committed to the ongoing work of addressing our ignorance. And it's ongoing. Yeah, you can clap for that. It's ongoing. So, like I said, there'll be times when, listen, I'm not practicing compassion all the time, I have to say. I'm sorry, Jesus, Buddha, all of y'all. I'm not my higher self all the time. But for me, the classroom is a sacred space. And I have to say, I don't want to give my give the impression that all my students are just remarkably ignorant. I have some of the most brilliant students in my classroom. Whether I'm talking about undergrads or graduate students, really just brilliant folks. But I come to the classroom with that sort of sacred perspective. As an educator, I have to have compassion for you, because I was in your shoes. I was in your, I was a student, right? So that's how I approach it.